All right, let's do it. Welcome back to the Hockey Minute. I am your host, Brandon. Big show for you today. I've got the goalie guru from InGoal Magazine and NHL.com, Kevin Woodley. We get into goaltending in a way that only Kevin can. If you haven't heard him before, I think he really is the best voice in the game in terms of breaking down goaltending. He's got an awesome ability to explain the voodoo of goaltending in a really understandable way. Last night, the Canucks closed out a back-to-back series with the Winnipeg Jets with a disappointing 5-2 loss on the back of Demko's first career shutout the previous night. This team just can't seem to get any kind of positive momentum going. It's perpetually 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that brings me to this week's rant. The morning after a 5-2 loss to the Jets, I'm sitting here thinking about how the Canucks have found yet another way to demonstrate their mediocrity this season. Mediocrity might even be the high watermark for the season, which up to this point has been almost entirely disappointing. The Canucks would need to go something like 21-9 to hit the playoff bar. They've won back-to-back games this season only once. They're 0-13 in games where they give up the first goal. Now, on average, NHL teams should win about 1 out of every 3 games when they get scored on first. The Canucks are pointless in those games. Ottawa, one of the only teams in the whole league worse than the Canucks by points percentage, is 5-13-0 when scored on first. The Detroit Red Wings, another terrible team, are 2-11-2 when they get scored on first. The inept Buffalo Sabres are 2-10-1 when scored on first. This is a terrible Canucks team, and it's not getting any better. Bo Horvat's gone cold, 1 point in his last 6 games, 4 points in his last 12. Tanner Pearson, the Canucks' biggest trade asset, whatever that's worth, a second or a third, has gone cold. Only 1 point in his last 12 games. Jake Virtanen, another quote-unquote asset, hasn't scored since his 4th game of the season. Adam Gaudette hasn't taken a step or really helped this team at all. Travis Green is admittedly frustrated, and Jim Benning looks unwilling or unable to make a move. Look, the list of bright spots this season is short. It's Brock Besser and Niels Höglander. I'm not saying blow the whole team up for one lost season. There's still a phenomenal young core there, but there are dramatic changes that need to be made for this team to be competitive next year, and management sitting on their hands is never going to get it done. All right, you're listening to the Hockey Minute. I am Brandon Frederick, and that was this week's rant brought to you by absolutely nobody. For sponsorship opportunities, drop me a line at hockeyminute@gmail.com. Make sure you join the conversation. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at the Hockey Minute. And now it's time to throw it over to our interview with the goalie guru, Kevin Woodley.
Hey, it's Ray Farrell from TSN and the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast. I was going through some stuff and I realized there's another podcast out there, the Hockey Minute.
Burrow steals, cutting in, shoots, scores! They've slayed the dragon!
Really? Another hockey podcast? Another podcast in general? And is it a minute long or is it like a full podcast?
And over the line, he's made, going in on goal, he shoots, he scores!
Oh my goodness.
Is that Paul Correa?
Yes, it is.
Paul Correa leveled.
My. This is the first open ice big hit that Scott Stevens has thrown in the series. Paul Correa landed on his back and didn't move.
And the fans on their feet because Paul Correa has just come back from the dressing room and onto the bench. Into the zone, Sikora kicked it out, got it back near side Correa. Correa, the fans want one. Score!
Make that 3 of us, and I haven't even asked Gary yet.
I really can't get behind this idea. I mean, what the hell do you know about hockey? And who is the Hockey Minute? Who? Anybody. Anybody know?
Carey, McSorley, to Gretzky! Scores! He did it! He did it! The greatest goal scorer in National Hockey League history!
Find out. Listen. Check it out. I mean, it's only going to take a minute. It won't take that much time. I'm going to check it out. I'm going to see if this podcast is any good.
Sidney Crosby, the golden goal!
Bud, do you even know how to skate?
And after 22 years, Raymond Mark!
Be well, Hockey Minute. Be well, Brandon. Later.
All right, joining me here on the Hockey Minute is Kevin Woodley from NHL.com and InGoal Magazine. He was also a long-time contributor to TSN 1040 with his hilarious and insightful Morning Wood segment. Kevin has the best insight into goaltending, which has to be the least understood position in terms of hockey and maybe even all of professional sport. Kevin, thanks for doing this, man. Welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure. Although I got to say, if anyone who's listened to those hits knows that a Hockey Minute is definitely not enough for my rambling about the position.
And before we get too deep into the Canucks and all things about the position, I just want to kind of talk about it generally. And just I touched on it on the intro there, but do you look at goaltending as one of the most unique positions in professional sport?
Yeah, and it's funny because I've had this discussion, and I probably was a little too pig-headed in my side of it in years past with guys like Farhan Lalji here in Vancouver about maybe being the toughest position in sport. The argument, quarterback versus goaltending, and my argument was, well, quarterback sort of gets yes, he doesn't know what the defense is doing, but he sort of predetermines what's going to happen a little bit by the play he calls, so he has an understanding, whereas a goaltender has no control over what's happening in front of them. But I've since softened on that because I've realized how just how absurdly difficult the quarterback position is, and also Roberto Luongo laughed at the premise when it was presented to him. So we'll call it the second hardest position in sports, and it is quite often misunderstood, and frankly that's why I got into it, to be perfectly honest. I had an invitation during his first time with the Canucks. So Ian Clarke, the goaltending coach, has been here twice. His first time around with the team, he started running a magazine called Goalie News. He asked me if I wanted to edit it. A part of that editing required me to read through all of his instructional material, and it was quite detailed. And I started learning things about the position. And I'd been covering the league already for 4 years, I think, for the Associated Press at the time. And like everyone else in media, good goal, bad goal, we judged it based on what we thought, made those up, what we thought the parameters were, but nobody was really asking or trying to understand what the goalie was trying to do. And there's that constant give and take in the position, and where there's sort of a sliding scale, like aggression. So if you're aggressive, you're on the shooter, but you're going to give up the back door. So I started to learn more about the technique, and I started to have conversations with goaltenders for the magazine, but starting to speak that language, and it opened up a whole new world to me. One that, I think increasingly people are more aware of. I think there's more people in the media that try and do the same thing now, try and have those conversations. You've got more goalie coaches in the league now too. So when media have access to them, they can learn about the position. But it just, it started there, and it started, frankly, a love affair with the position that included learning to play it. I wasn't a goalie, didn't play a ton of hockey, to be honest. But I started in my mid-30s and just, started quite technically knowing these sort of technical foundations that Ian Clarke taught, and probably looked really robotic out there compared to people that grew up from my era playing the position, a more fluid, reactive position. But just, fell in love with all aspects of it, from the gear to the technique to that sort of constant give and take. And that's the beautiful thing. The thing I love about it, every week we have conversations with NHL goalies and goalie coaches on the InGoal radio podcast. And every week it's something new and something different. There's no one absolute correct one way to play the position. And that's what makes it so fascinating. But trying to understand everybody's approach and where it fits on that sliding scale is exciting. It's fun, and I learn something all the time. So what more can you ask for in a job than to be constantly learning?
Yeah, that's right, man. And do you think that the way that NHL executives and talent evaluators look at goalies has really evolved with your thinking over the years of it? Because it seems like, at least the public perception of goaltending has shifted a little bit, where you can't quite compare a team where you can't quite compare two goalies without looking at the team in front of them, right? Like you can't look at Jakob Markstrom's performance from last year versus Darcy Kemper's or whoever, right? Like it's impossible to go apples to apples without really looking at the team in front.
The way I throw it out there all the time, whether it was on 1040 before or other radio hits, it's become my go-to line. Goaltending never exists in a vacuum. It is so much a function of team play. And even then, even when we can sort of quantify using some of the new analytics that are out there, I have access to ClearSight Analytics by Stephen Valiquette. So to me, that's, in my opinion, that's one of the best sort of measurements of shot quality that's available, at least at the NHL level, and sort of filter through that and compare them. But even then, like even knowing that like this team gives up way more of this particular type of chance that goes in 30% of the time compared to this other one that gives up from the same spot, maybe a chance that only goes in 10% of the time, like being able to weight that and quantifying it matters. But even then, you don't know where in the system the goalie's sort of responsible for. Like when those breakdowns occur, how much of it is like planned, like, hey man, like we're allowing that pass. Your job is to be there versus, hey, our job is to cut that off. You got to stay on the shooter. And it's the simplest examples, like stay on the 2-on-1, but those exist all over the place. And, you know, speaking of constantly learning, we started at InGoal Magazine, we started something called InGoal Premium, a subscription service. And one of the things that have been most popular for us is something called Pro Read, where I will sit down with video of saves and plays, end zone time on a power play with an NHL goalie. And as they watch it with me, they will share what they're reading, what they're seeing, and why they're playing it. And a lot of it is, you know, handedness of shooters. Is he in a shooting position or passing position based on where he's holding his hands on the stick, how his body is oriented, where he's holding the puck relative to his body? And we started it, frankly, with the idea that kids, and I remember this in 2004 when I started digging into goaltending, I would have NHL goalies at the time say, man, I watch these 13-year-olds in the summer at camps and they move better than I do. And that's still true. I still hear that from guys who, you know, like even now in 2021, when we think the goal coaching is everywhere, like the game progresses at the grassroots level sometimes faster. And these kids come up knowing innately how to do things that NHLers are trying to learn on the fly in terms of movement. And it just keeps getting better. But not all of those kids learn how to read the game. And that's such an important part of it, being able to make those reads and process that information, which is why, like I said, like a quarterback, it's so tough. And in having these NHLers share those reads, the goal was to sort of show kids, hey, like these are some of the things you should be looking for. Here's how. But what I learned was just how much of it is related not to what you're expecting the opponent to do, but being able to know and trust what your defense is going to do. Like the first one I did with Freddie Anderson was just, Carey Price was our first guy, and he kind of blew my mind, the detail he picked up on shooters. But then with Freddie, there was a play where a defenseman pinched down on the wall, and then the puck got through to the guy in the back door. But he was talking about knowing where that defenseman was going, and the amount of processing that involved his own team system, again, just kind of blew me away. So there's another example, sort of constantly learning. But even when we sort through the data on that pass getting through, there's differences from team to team, and we don't know how much of that is, hey, the goalie should have known this was coming because the D is always going to move here, versus, damn, the D made a mistake, the goalie did his job. So even with all this analytics and all the data, there's still that element of the unknown that unless you get into that room and ask specifically, and we can't on every single save, we'd be there a while, you know, there's always going to be a bit of sort of that vacuum that you know, goaltending never exists in a vacuum. There'll always be a vacuum of information for us in terms of being able to interpret and analyze it.
Just to look, when you were talking there, you're talking about goalies making reads, and I'm sure you saw the highlight of Nate McKinnon coming down the wing and ripping it kind of mid stride on Arizona a couple of days ago. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but just the fact that Nathan McKinnon can shoot mid stride, how challenging is that for a goaltender to make a save on?
I'm not sure I saw it, to be honest. This is the problem with the divisions this year, right? You just can't keep up with everything. I'm so focused on the North right now, which is not the most goalie friendly division, by the way. But the thing that's happening here with shooters is, like, I hate to bring it back to goaltending, but they're finally catching up. Like, they're going to school in the summers with their skills coaches, learning different releases. Obviously Nathan McKinnon, like, there's a lot of God bless talent there, right? Mm-hmm. But these guys go to work in the summers now to improve their skills. Through most of my now 20-year career covering the league, the goalies have done that. they've gone to school in the summer with position-specific coaches to improve their technical foundation and how they move, the efficiency of movement, their ability to react. Like they've been ahead of that. It's only in the last, it might be more than 5 years, but I want to say around 5 years that we started to sort of hear about the Darryl Belfries of the world, who, by the way, was a former junior goaltender. These skills coaches that were players up until that point. Covering the league, you'd have teams would come back, and inevitably the players would be talking about, the work they did in the off season was like the Olympics, bigger, stronger, faster. It was all about physical. They weren't working on their skills other than going out and playing shinny. And that can be a great way to develop, natural skills, go play shinny. But there are now skills coaches out there like teaching different releases, deception on releases. There's one here in Vancouver, Ron Johnson. He worked with Ryan Kessler, and remember there were stories about how Kessler had improved his shot. Who's the other guy? Joe Pavelski is one of his clients, and Joe scores some goals that you're like, oh man, the goalie looked bad on that. But it's like, no. I remember in the playoffs once he scored on Jonathan Quick on a sort of fake shot from distance, beat him 5-hole on a rush, and it looked terrible. And everybody on Twitter's like, oh, it looks terrible. And Ron texted me, he's like, no. That was set up. Like, that was pure deception. He had made the same shot X number of times. Quick was expecting the same high shot. He showed him that shot and then changed delivery mid-release. And Quick was coming up, expecting what he was showing. And instead he delivered low, and he just fooled them. And so that level of deception, changing angle mid-shot, that wasn't there before. And so I do honestly believe that's the players catching up to the goalies in terms of how they go to work in the off season. It's not just bigger, stronger, faster. It's also all these skills. And of course the goalies have had to counter that. Well, now we're trying to find new ways biomechanically, and there are some that have been developed in the last 2 or 3 years, or understood better in the last 2 or 3 years, that allow you to stay visually on that puck longer through a release before giving up your edges and reacting, which should prevent you, or at least help reduce the amount of times you're susceptible to that level of deception. And I've had this discussion with goalie coaches around the league, because it's something they need to look out for now in terms of free agency and in terms of draft. Those reads I talked about, in terms of goalies being able to read and process the game, when it comes to reading a release, that's a skill that used to be invaluable. But now you got to be careful, because there are some guys that are really good at it, but you can be over reliant on it. If you are going early in terms of your reaction as a goaltender based on what a shooter is showing you and your incredible ability to read all those elements. But now we have a whole nother generation of shooters that's being taught how to show that and deliver something else.
Right.
You're in trouble. So guys that can sort of track through releases longer have more value, and guys that are relying more on all the extra information to know where that shot is going are more susceptible to this new generation of deceptive shooters.
Wow.
It's a fascinating give and take.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about players taking advantage of skills coaches in a way that goaltenders have for years. One quick note on that, when you were talking, that came to mind though, was maybe think of it. Do you remember Chris Tanev going to Steven Stamkos' shooting coach? That was like 2014 or 15 or something like that, and they were talking about how he was ready to come back after the offseason with the big shot, and he was still, the player at a certain point is still just the player, right?
Yeah, there are still square pegs and round holes, right?
Yeah, exactly. But just to transition to the Canucks proper, I wanted to kind of get into last season just a little bit. And I know you're a big ClearSight analytics guy, and for the 2019-2020 season, they have Markstrom listed as the top goalie in terms of expected versus actual save percentage. They ranked 27th overall as a team in terms of mid and high percentage shots against. I mean, they lost their MVP goalie and their best defender, who I still think is criminally underrated even today. And they replaced them with basically league average players in terms of defending and goaltending. Is it just as simple as that to kind of explain the Canucks season thus far?
Maybe a little bit. I hate to go intangibles on you a little bit, but it's also kind of hard. It's such a weird year, right? You don't know how the pandemic is affecting different people. And I think there's a human element that we have to be cognizant of a little bit. I was talking with a goalie last night. We actually did a pro read with an Eastern Conference, or I guess I don't even know what the hell they are, to be honest. I don't know what division they play in down there.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the Southeast United States.
Yeah.
We did a video session last night, and after we were done, he started talking about the fans, because the fans have been allowed back in the building and what a difference it makes, and how much easier it is to sort of get motivated for games. And yeah, the bubble we did, but it was playoffs and you hated them right away. And you know what I like, it's harder in a regular season. And so we don't know how things are affecting players differently. So you have to throw that caveat out. I do think that losing Tanev in the room, like on the ice for sure, you saw what he did with like how good that pairing was with Quinn Hughes, and big difference for Quinn Hughes coming into his first camp with Chris Tanev and his second with Jalen Chatfield as sort of primary guy he was with in training camp, and then Hamonic comes in. It just hasn't been ideal, right? I mean, you change the mix, no camp, no preseason, and 3 new pairings, you're going to have some problems. And you're right, defensively they're 31st in the league right now. They've gotten better in the last couple of weeks, but they're still, despite all that, still 31st. Just no longer, the gap isn't as big, because before they were 31st and they could have been 61st. There could have been 30 more teams between them and number 30. Like they were so bad, like the multiple breakaways, the odd man rushes, the 2-on-0 shorthanded, like just like it looked at times like they didn't know how to play hockey, right? Like it looked at times, frankly, from a goalie perspective, like beer league. Like they make a save on a highly skilled player like Nick Suzuki on a breakaway, and oh, by the way, nobody bothered to pick up Josh Anderson, the trailer, on the breakaway. So he gets to tap it in. That's like beer league goalie frustration. So there is an element to that. I do think they miss in the room. Tanev with Hughes, these young kids. Stetcher, I think, was an underrated defenseman, even though you can't blame that one on management. I think coaching staff maybe underappreciated him as well a little bit and didn't mind seeing him go. Yet he was the guy that Elias Pettersson spent most of his time with, when he stayed here in Vancouver during the pandemic. Like they were tight. Jakob Markstrom, that mentorship, that fieriness that he brought to the room, that desire to win that he brought, the friendship as a fellow Swede. Like there's a lot going on for a really young group. They lost a lot of people that were important to them both on and off the ice. On the ice, defensively, absolutely. It's been at times, as I said, abhorrent. It has gotten better lately. Where I would quibble a little bit is with the goaltending. And I think, I'm going to be honest, when I shared these numbers on Twitter, I think last week with Demko's adjusted numbers. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't go to ClearSight looking to make a point, because I didn't expect them to be that high. I honestly didn't. I figured, like you said, we'd be talking about league average. I thought that, I was of the opinion, and it was one that was being shared commonly in the media just as a default narrative, was that the goaltending hasn't been the problem, but it hasn't been good enough, right? Like that was kind of what, and I was in tune with that. So I looked it up, and I was a little surprised. Like Thatcher Demko's adjusted numbers are like right now 6th in the NHL in terms of goals saved, and just a little bit lower that in terms of save percentage versus expected. So he's been fine. Matter of fact, like somebody's like, oh, the goaltending's been fine. I'm like, no. And then I actually started to hear the narrative in the last little while, the goaltending hasn't been good enough. I'm like, well, actually, Thatcher Demko's like, if you can't win with top 6 goaltending, maybe it's not your goaltending, right? And so Holtby struggled a little more. He's just above average, but he's not below. He's not below expected. Like there are guys in this league with much bigger tickets and much bigger profile that are playing a lot worse and not getting the attention because they're still getting wins. But Demko's like legitimately having a hell of a season. And I think you'll start to see them give him some leash here and play a little more. So yeah, that jumped out to me, right? Now, the one thing that Markstrom didn't do that I think you have to also filter through, I started to dig through the numbers a little bit here. Low percentage shots. Jakob gave up 9 all last year, none on ClearSight. Like ClearSight, like those are the ones that you got to stop 99.9% of the time. Low percentage shots. If your goalie gives up a low percentage goal and the goalie at the other end of the ice doesn't reciprocate, your team loses 87% of the time. So when we talk about timely saves, they're not just the highlight reels in a 1-goal game. It's not giving up the bad ones. And Demko with 6 and Holtby with 4 have combined already for more than Jakob Markstrom gave up all last season with 9. So that, as much as his overall adjusted numbers for Demko are really good, I mean, not Jakob Markstrom first or second in the league good, but like, 6, not that bad. Top 10, you're getting top 10 goaltending. If you required top 2 goaltending, again, that's a team problem. But there are discrepancies in there, and those low percentage goals can make it confidence in front of you can become an issue if teams are worried about that going in, right? You never had to worry about that. That's why Jakob was perfect behind a young defense, because he erased so many of those mistakes, and he didn't let any that made you sort of waver in your confidence. So, that fair is fair. You got to compare them entirely, but overall, Demko hasn't been an issue. And I think with Braden Holtby, I've watched on an almost daily basis when the team's in town, the work he's putting in with Ian Clarke. And I think I underestimated how hard some of these changes would be, and that they might, because I've had the privilege of working with Braden in Kelowna one summer and talked to Mitch Korn and talked to Scott Murray, his former goalie coaches. And one thing they always remarked on was his ability to control his body and make it do what he wants, and to make changes because of that sort of body control was just at another level. And so I expected the changes to come quickly here, and they haven't. Like it's an empty arena right now. So I'm out there watching the early skates, and Ian Clarke and Thatcher Demko will be down at one end of the ice working on one thing before anybody else comes out. And it'll be Mikey DiPietro and Braden Holtby at the other. And there's been a couple of times where I've heard Braden say to Mikey, I don't know how you do that. I can't do that. Physically, I can't, And so remember Jakob Markstrom, his first year with Clarke, and how good things were going. And the things he said to me at the end of that season was, I'm really excited for next year because I get to go into the summer and remove some of the physical limitations that are currently preventing me from making even more changes he wants me to make. And I watched this, and I can't help but wonder if some of the things they're trying to institute may be beyond the current physical limitations of Braden Holtby in terms of mobility, butterfly width, flair, some things that, and again, at his age and being this long in the league, are the things he's going to change? I'm not sure. So there's a lot more to that process than frankly even I thought there would be. But I have a hunch watching it. I see buy-in from Braden as he's doing these things. I don't think this is a resistance to change. I could see this, as much as we're all over him right now. I could see this being a guy who in the second half of the season, starts to find some things and blend that with how he plays. And don't write him off yet, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I mean, if the things keep trending the way that they're trending, Thatcher Demko is going to get, 66% of the starts, and he's going to get a little more time to work in his game. So maybe he will round it out into form. I'm hopeful, just as a Canucks fan, I hope he gets something there. And the way that he's playing, though, I don't think Seattle's going to take him. So he's probably going to get another summer to work with Ian Clarke, right?
Well, to be honest with you, that's the one thing that I liked about this fit is Braden loves to work. They used to have to back him off in Washington when he was playing so much. He just loves to be out there working. He is not shy. And listen, Ian Clarke is one of the more demanding goalie coaches that I've met in terms of the standard he sets with his goalies is we're the most important position on the ice, and we need to be the hardest working position on the ice. And Braden, there's no problem there. So I've already watched a lot of the work they're doing, and when he's not playing, he's out there busting it. So I think this process, again, we'll see what happens down the stretch. I think this process is one that, might pay off in the final month of the season. And yeah, Seattle's going to have lots of options. Then it'll depend what other options are on them. I mean, let's not forget, I had somebody in the Vegas organization. I was pretty confident that if Jakob Markstrom just a few years ago had been exposed on waivers, Vegas wouldn't have taken him. And here we are a few years later. He's the hottest name, in free agency last October. So things change in a hurry. And I guess what I'm saying is Braden Holtby could go on a heater here in March and have them thinking about it. It all depends, right? Is Jake Allen a slam dunk out of Montreal? Might the other guy end up, on an unprotected list in Montreal? You never know how these things pan out. And it all depends on what else is available, right? Braden Holtby versus what else do the Canucks have to expose that might have higher value to Seattle? It'll be fascinating to see how it pans out. And I think if we learn anything about Vegas, we know that we really have no idea how it's going to pan out right now. We're guessing.
Yeah, well, for sure. But you have to think that it's not going to pan out for for Seattle as it did for Vegas, just with them being able to look 2 years back or 3 years back and kind of see how it all played. Just about in terms of the North Division's goaltending, do you think that Jakob Markstrom is kind of the top of that heap right now?
That's interesting. Last year he was deserving to be a Vezina finalist, But at the end of the day, like, I think the save percentage, he was slightly ahead and adjusted, but Hellebuck was, total goals saved was slightly ahead. So like Connor was, and he played a lot more. Mm-hmm. And Connor was, as much as I think the narrative about the defense in Winnipeg actually overshot the shot quality, like the environment, as much as it was all about how the defensemen they lost in Winnipeg, the reality is the defensive environment they created with lesser names was actually more friendly for goaltending than what Markstrom faced in Vancouver. That's what the numbers say. Hellebuck was still a very, very deserving Vezina candidate. And if you watched him on Saturday night, he's right in that conversation again, the 40 save effort against Toronto. So, against, I can't remember. They're all like Toronto played Edmonton. So that was Winnipeg against Montreal. There we go. Yeah. I had that's just, it's Groundhog Day. So yeah, like he's in that conversation. I don't know that he's, is he at the top of it? Not right now. It hasn't been a great season or a great start. Or it was in Calgary, and then he had a couple starts where he looked like he was playing through something, and sure enough, he was. Which is, one of the things you have to be careful with Jakob is he will play hurt, and it sometimes to his own detriment. His numbers fell off, so he's certainly in that conversation. I think with Hellebuck. I'm not ready to write off Price completely, although I'm not making any excuses. This year has been bad, but I also think that a lot of people just seem to want to jump and say, like, Carey Price hasn't been good since he won the Vezina in the Hart. And I'm like, yeah, 2 years ago, the only guy who saved more goals in the entire NHL was Vasilevsky. Like in 2018-19, Price should have been a Vezina finalist when you look at the numbers. So he's not that far removed. We saw what he can do in the bubble last year. But certainly right now, it's sort of a Hellebuck Markstrom conversation for sure.
That's interesting in Montreal. I mean, if you look at kind of the Habs Twitter, it seems like most people there, or the vocal ones, are kind of wishing that they could expose Price and keep Allen.
Well, I mean, I may or may not have 4 or 5 years. Well, whenever it was, when Seattle got a team, and I was asked who would be their Marc-Andre Fleury, Carey Price. Like, you never know how these things work out. It sure would be probably be a welcome. Wow, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but like, there's a lot of things that fit from a family perspective as well. And
West Coast,
yeah, and Washington State, wife from Washington State, family from Washington State, spends his summers in Washington State and Eastern Washington State, splits between there and Kelowna, like, and just a level of anonymity. As much as he would be a face of a franchise, it wouldn't be. You can't go to the store unless the store's been closed and everybody's been cleared before you go in there type of face of the franchise, and that's what it is in Montreal. It's not easy. So the other thing too is, like, listen, there are some things in his game and in the way it fits that system that are problematic right now. He's getting killed on those clear sight, low danger shots. There's been more of them already this year than we would expect from him in an entire season. That's a problem. Also screens and traffic have been hugely problematic. Carey's a guy who's always liked to, rather than getting up high like Jakob Markstrom when the play's on the perimeter and looking over screens, he's always a guy who's gotten low and wide and tried to look around screens. And then what did they do? They added that St. Louis quote unquote type of defense, including a member of the Blues. And they've basically put a bunch of oak trees, they're wearing the same jersey as Price, but they're standing in front of him. And so now he's no longer just battling offensive screens. He's trying to find sight lines through his own guys. And I'm not sure he's going to be able to do that, trying to look around them as much as he used to. He might have to adjust the tactic there. And again, I'm not excusing his season, but when I break it down in terms of what's happening, the goals that are costing him, the ones that are the difference between what we expect of him and where he is now, and, all these question marks being raised, screens are a massive part of it. And they've changed the defense. They've changed how that defense plays a little bit. And, he's going to have to make some adjustments, because I do think that when you filter through the numbers, that's one of the biggest problems he's in his game right now. And I it's not necessarily all of his doing, but he's going to be the one who has to find a way to play behind that.
Is that a GM or like a management issue to not consult your goaling coach or your goaltending coach about the changes you're going to make to the system in front of your kind of the key cog of your whole team?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd blame that. I mean, I'm sure Carey likes having these, he's talked about, like guys like Weber and clearing the crease and preventing second chances. It's just, sometimes, yes, sometimes you make changes, or sometimes you bring a goalie in and then ask him to play differently than play away from his strengths, or you bring a goalie in and statistically you look at his strengths and you bring him into a team where the types of chances you give up play to his weaknesses. Those are times where I'd be like, what the hell are you doing? You're just going and getting a name. You're not actually paying attention to how he plays and whether it fits. And I think much like golf, there is some horses for courses to this, right? Certain golf courses fit the eye for certain golfers and they always play well there. There are certain systems and structures that some guys are going to be better behind. Mm-hmm. And getting a guy who doesn't fit that and paying him a lot of money for a long time and then asking him to change makes no sense to me. But there are other elements within building a team where, the goalie can and sometimes has to make some adjustments. And I would say that this probably fits more to, now listen, some of this could be systems too, like in terms of, it's one thing to have all these big bodies, but how they play screens and how they play, shot blocking and things like that, you might have to make some adjustments there. And that's the other problem. When things start going bad for a goalie, your teammates, whether it's consciously we have to help this guy or subconsciously he's not going to bail us out, I got to block this shot. As soon as you get other guys trying to do the goalie's job and running around trying to get in front of everything, you usually create more problems than you solve, because everyone's out trying to do his job and pretty soon nobody's doing their own job. And now you've got lanes that aren't filled, and it just tends to, that's a snowball that can get rolling downhill. Steve Mason's my favorite example. Made really good changes to his game in Columbus, was on the verge of a breakthrough like that happened as soon as he was traded to Philly. But he told me after the fact it never would have happened in Columbus, because that snowball I just talked about where they didn't trust him and he didn't trust them because everybody's trying to do everybody else's job. It had rolled so far down the hill and gotten so big that he just said it was never going to work there. But as soon as he went to Philly, he had success. So I don't think they're there with Carey, but to me, that's an example of a change a goalie can make. I did find it interesting when I talked to the Calgary goalie coaches after they hired Jason LaBarbera and then moved Jordan Sigalet up to director of goaltending. We had them both in the podcast together, and they talked about getting to know Jakob. One of the reasons they made the move when they did was so that Jakob wouldn't have to mid-season or after one season switch the voice. But they talked about their conversations with Jakob being about, how do you like to play this? How do you like to play that? How would you like us to set up on this and that? And he had a voice in that, as opposed to, hey, we just gave you $36 million. Don't really give a crap how you want to play a certain type of shot. This is how we do it here. You change. I loved the fact that he was involved in that conversation, because I got to be honest, I'm not going to name names here, but I've seen it go the other way in a hurry, where you trade for a guy or sign a guy and give him an extension and promptly expect him to play to his biggest weaknesses. And then when things go downhill, it's like, well, this guy didn't live up to his end of the bargain or his contract. And it's like, no, you failed him as an organization because you put him in a position to fail after giving him money, which everyone's going to take. Like, it's not his fault. I could have told you these are his strengths and weaknesses. Why are you asking him to play to the weaknesses? Happens a lot more than you think. So that's why I found the approach to Markstrom so refreshing.
Yeah, and hopefully we kind of see more of that going forward with teams. I think the whole idea of bringing your star players in and letting them have a voice is can only be beneficial. I just wanted to change gears a little bit before I run out of time with you here. I just wanted to touch on the whole Jake Virtanen situation. I'm not going to ask you to say too much about it, but I wanted to ask in general, like, can we look at Jake Virtanen and think that Danton Heinen is kind of what we should expect in return as a player? I mean, just to go over a couple of numbers really quick when I was looking into this, I mean, Jake Virtanen sitting at 0.32 points per game. I mean, if he didn't have the draft pedigree that he had, he would have been out of the league a long time ago. I mean, Sven Berchi has 291 games played, so a few less games played, but he's got 0.47 points a game and he's playing in the AHL. I mean, I know there's concussion issues and other things around there, but Danton Heinen sitting at 0.46 points a game, 245 games played. So he's a more productive player than Jake Virtanen. But I think if you look at kind of Canucks Twitter and the Canucks fandom in general, they think of Heinen as a boring, unproductive player compared to what Virtanen could be. So when you look at a trade like Heinen for Virtanen, is that kind of what you would expect?
Yeah, let's just put it this way. My expectations are not high for the return on this. And
No.
it's not just because of all those things you said about the player here. Like, obviously he tantalized with the 18 goals last year, and without the benefit of a ton of it being on the power play. But I think it was Harm Dial that had it in the Athletic. Like, he broke down sort of how those 18 goals happened and how maybe we should expect some regression, and maybe they should have sold high last year. Mm-hmm. And turns out it was a hell of an argument, right? It was a little prescient, which is not surprising because he's so good at what he does. But this isn't just Jake Virtanen and giving him a chance to move on. And maybe he does find something. Maybe like all the things that he seems unable to comprehend here suddenly click somewhere else. I don't know. There's a toolbox there, right? But nobody's been able to sort of crack the lock on it. At this point, the whole concept of what he might be, I mean, we're pretty well into this, right? Like, and outside of last year, we haven't seen much of it. So, last year sort of makes it hard to let go. That in the pedigree makes it hard to let go and not expect a return. But the contract they signed him to makes it almost impossible to expect a return. Yeah. Like, that second year is like a poison pill. I mean, if he was having another 18-goal year, no problem. But they backloaded it based on finances because they didn't want to spend a lot of money this season. And now it's lowered the value of the asset. An asset that I think, it's not hindsight to say should have been traded at a high last year. And I can say it's not hindsight because Harm said it and wrote it and showed why. So, it's just the pandemic is tough. Like I said, we need to understand where players are sometimes and understand, try and be sensitive to what might be happening, in their environment, in their world that's making life more difficult. And I guess maybe we have to grant the same to ownership, no money coming in. But they made a lot of moves. Like, the Virtanen contract is one that appears to be backloaded largely so you don't have to spend real cash this year. Yeah. And it's biting them because that means it's backloaded for a second year and a qualifying offer of $3.4 million. Like, having to qualify Jake, it's just all those things add up to lowering his value amidst a down season. So now you can make arguments that don't trade him now because his value is at its lowest. And maybe that's fair because you missed your window. And maybe if you think this coach can play him back into an 18-goal pace and increase that value, then I'd hear that argument. But we're going to have to see signs that he's capable of it. And hey, I think, we're coming up, looks like he's going to stay on that, second line with Horvat, at least to start going into Winnipeg. And maybe that's enough to get him on a heater and I don't want to say pull the wool over some team's eyes, because they've seen what we've seen. The numbers you just said, we're far enough into the career here that it's not, could he unlock it? But right now, with that contract, it's kind of hard to see how the return, gets any sweeter. And frankly, based on what I understand, is like Anaheim was looking for a sweetener in that deal. So as much as the Canucks fans think they should get more, the way they structured that contract, and that's on them, actually has lowered the value significantly, not just because of the player, but because of what he's set to be paid next season and how he comes out of that in terms of a qualifying offer.
Well, just speaking on Canucks management, if you were a betting man, would you put money on Jim Benning starting the season next year as GM for the Canucks?
I hate these things because it's almost like Jim's so good with us and open and honest with the media. And I'm not even in a position where I'm looking to get big scoops and that's not how my gig works at NHL.com anymore. But I just love the honesty and the openness, even if it's bit him in the ass. And frankly, we've buried him with it at times in the media locally. So you never wish ill of anyone. But I think right now, the way some of those contracts, those sort of middle-aged contracts that were signed are hurting them, it's probably hard to see. I'm a little more worried, frankly, about what happens with the coaching staff and whether moves are made there. Not just Travis Green. We talked a lot about Ian Clarke here. This is a guy who walked from Columbus before his contract expired. He was out of there because they didn't negotiate early enough in good faith. And we're approaching the time of the month, roughly, or the time of the year, like the month of the year, where that decision was made by him in Columbus. And if there's no traction here, I could very much see a similar thing playing out here. So now not only do you come out of the pandemic having lost players and taken a step back as a team, they already lost Manny Malhotra.
Yeah.
And if you don't think finances played a role in that one, I know it was spun as an opportunity to be on the bench, but there's more to that in terms of, a willingness to spend that went into that decision as well. If you were to come out of this and lose the goalie coach who helped, and I should say helped, Dan Kluche deserves a lot of credit for starting the process, but the goalie coach that helped get Markstrom to Vezina caliber, the goaltending coach who's gotten Thatcher Demko, helped Thatcher Demko get to top 6 in the league adjusted. You come out losing him, as well as potentially Travis Green and the job he's done with his young players. I know this year is crap, but to that point and the work he does here, I think that would be even more problematic. Like, it's just a lot of things that feel like the cracks that are in the foundation could spill over here once we get through the season and cost you things beyond just the players on the ice that hurt you as an organization in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so, I guess, tragic. I don't know a better word for it for Canucks fans right now, is because you look at this core that they have and you think, man, like that is a contending caliber core that they've built. With a few pieces that they need to obviously get them over the hump, and they just don't. They're capped out, and we know all the issues with this team, right? All the bad contracts, the Luongo, the bear cheese, all those kinds of things are holding this team back, and it just feels like with Aquilini kind of closing the checkbook a little bit, presumably anyway. Obviously I can't say for sure, but it just seems like this is the absolute worst time for this to happen to this team, and we might even lose Travis Green, and I'm a huge Green fan. I really think he's done the best that can be done with the roster that's in front of him. So just like you just laid out for us, man, it's a scary year to be a Canucks fan. I'm really curious to see where this is going to go.
Yeah, me too. And it's funny, I was talking to that goalie the other night. He actually picked this team halfway through last season, right before the pandemic, to be the one that breaks out. Like because he loved their roster of forwards and thought their defense, despite some of the metrics, did a pretty good job, and he loved their goaltending. And he has a friend who's on the team, plays on the team as well. And he's like, when you get to that point and you just feel like everything's headed in the right direction, and you're going to be a group that contends, to have those moves in the off season that you have to sort of swallow and lose those key players, but then to have the bottom fall out and have he's like, it's hard to describe just how hard that is emotionally and mentally to go through, to have your expectations and there's no reset. Like, we're so, like, there's that, as a goalie, you can't live in the past. You can't look at the goal. Like, it's all about resetting to the present, but it still feels like there's an element here where they're just like, oh man, like, can we just start over again? Because we're better than this. And yet the hole they dug them means it's probably not going to be enough. And I mean, the hole they dug themselves, both with their play in January, but also with their off-season moves as well. It just doesn't feel like it's going to be enough. And for this group to feel like they were taking a step and ready to compete for, maybe compete for a cup, to now potentially competing for, a lottery spot, like high lottery spot. It's not just the fan base, folks. These players are feeling that as well.
Wow. Yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, to be Quinn Hughes basically battling for the Calder last year, being easily one of the top 10 defensemen last season, to now thinking about whether or not they're going to be crappy enough to draft his brother. I mean, I can't imagine what that's like.
Yeah, it probably doesn't feel like a silver lining yet for him.
No, exactly. And I think this, you're right. It's a lost season. I think it's like 22-10. They'd have to go to hit the playoffs at 63 points. So even if they banged off 12 straight, they'd still have to manage to go 500, which they haven't done up to this point. So I can't imagine it. But Kevin, man, I know I'm at the end of my time here with you. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you coming on to chat goaltending. I learned a lot. I'm going to continue to follow your work and keep learning. So maybe you could just let the listeners here know where they can find you and keep up with you.
Yeah, no, Kevin is in goal is the Twitter handle. I'm not as active as I used to be on the day-to-day stuff in terms of Canucks, but, post some rosters and stuff and lineups and things like that. Mostly goalie stuff. InGoal Media on social media, on both Twitter and on Instagram. That's where we do a lot of our links, as well as Facebook, InGoal Magazine on Facebook. It's where we send a lot of links to our stories. A lot of them are behind a paywall now. They really are goalie specific. You got to be sort of a goalie to benefit or enjoy them. They're about helping you get better as a player, as a goalie, whether you're, peewee to pro, frankly. We have 2/3 of the league's goalie coaches and over 100 now goalie coaches that coach professionally all over the world. So subscribe to see some of the drills and some of the tips and some of the things that we're sharing from their peers in the NHL. So yeah, if you're a goalie, if you're not a goalie, maybe you'll want to learn something about goaltending. I know a few GMs and head coaches that could learn a few things about goaltending by reading what we're doing. But if you are a goalie, we've definitely got something for you. If you're a young goalie, and the other thing, free taste of it all is the InGoal Radio podcast hosted by Darren Millard. Comes out every week. Find it on iTunes, and podcasts are awesome, especially with no 1040. We gotta support those.
Yeah, exactly. You got to find a way to get your guys' voice out there, man. I know I'm not the only one that's missing hearing you. So again, man, thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully we'll catch you again down the road.
Thanks so much for having me.